Alright, what's up nerds? This is Cam. Today I'm going to keep working on the UI for my inventory system. Essentially what we're going to be doing is adding a thumbnail to the one of the inventory slots when you pick an item up, and then you'll be able to drag that thumbnail into an equip slot to add the item to your player. Just to start, I have this image that I've downloaded from user QBotUp from opengameart.org, and it's just a variety of thumbnails that I've split up to be each their own sprite. And so I'm just going to get started here, and I want to get started by looking at my inventory item class. So this is the class that we're using to send information to the inventory controller from our object. So what we want to do is put a sprite on here so it can store our thumbnail that we're going to be using. So I'm just going to call it thumbnail. And then if I pop onto my rifle equip logic here, it'll have a field for our thumbnail in inventory item here. So then I'm just going to go down to my sprites here that I've split up, and the first one is a little thumbnail for a weapon, so I'm going to use that, and that'll be good enough for now. And I'm just going to reference that there. And then I'm going to go into my inventory controller here, which is on my player. And for inventory controller, right now what we're doing is we're just adding the action mixin into our inventory, but we're going to actually want to send more information than that because our inventory is going to need access to the thumbnail and different things that we're going to need to associate to our item. So what I'm actually going to do is, instead of sending in the equip mixin, which is actually stored within our inventory item as well, here, we're sending in the inventory type and the equipped mixin. What I'm actually just going to send in is the inventory item, and that will send in all the information we need. So then I can go to my inventory controller here, and I'll change this to just receiving a inventory item. And I'll call this item. So that's going to have all the information we need, including that equipped mixin and including the inventory type and the thumbnail. So then when I'm looking through this, instead of comparing this to type, which was the parameter we sent in, I'm going to compare it to item dot inventory type. Yeah, item dot inventory type, and that'll accomplish the same thing. And then in inventory, I'm just going to add this item. So I'm just passing the item right through to my inventory. So now if I go to my inventory here, I'm going to change this from a list of mixin bases to a list of inventory. Actually, for this list, I'm going to make a new class, and I'm going to have that class control my actual inventory slots here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a component to this, and I'm going to call it inventory slot. And inventory slot, all it's going to do is have a reference to my inventory item. And I'll just call this item. But it's going to have an add function here. Actually, I'm going to make add a return a bool, because basically when I try to add to a slot, I'm going to ask if it was successful, and if it wasn't, then I'm going to move on to try to the next, add something to the next slot. So we'll do a public bool add, and it's going to take an inventory item. And we'll just call this add me. And this is going to return true. And basically what we're going to say is, if we have an item, so if item doesn't equal null, then you can't add an item to this slot right now, so we'll return false. And if we can, then, if we don't have an item, then we'll add this item that we're being sent. So what we'll say is item equals add me. And then what we want to do now is set our thumbnail. So we're going to get a reference to our image here. So we'll say, and we'll call this thumbnail image. And we have to add a UI namespace here. Okay, so that works fine. And then we can say our thumbnail image the override sprite for it is going to equal item.thumbnail. So this will override the sprite of our image, and it will equal the image that's stored on our item, which is our inventory item that our object has. So you can give each object a unique thumbnail, and this inventory slot will automatically display it. So I can hit save here. and go here. So this has inventory slot, and then we just need to drag a reference of our item component, or sorry, our image component on our thumbnail image, and the item will be set automatically. So now we just have to call that add function. So if I go back to my inventory, we're going to change this to a list of inventory slots. And then we're going to say, when our add function is called, I'm going to change the name of this. I'm going to call it inventory slots. We're going to loop through all of our inventory slots. And then I'm going to say inventory slots at I dot add, and we're going to add the inventory slot that we're being sent, and we're going to send that through. Or sorry, this is an inventory item we're being sent. So we'll receive the inventory item from our inventory controller and send it on to our inventory slot. And just make sure our inventory controller is working. So it's going to loop through our inventories and send in an inventory item. So that's perfect. That's exactly what we want. And that should all be working. So now we just have to populate our list of inventory slots here, which is going on in inventory. And what I'm going to do a bit of an easy way to do this, because there's a lot of slots to drag and drop. So sometimes it can be okay just to hard code it, even though it means that your scene can only be set up in one way, but sometimes that's okay. So I'm going to say public void start, and then I'm just going to say inventory slots, and I get an array of inventory slots, and I'm going to call them inventories, and they're going to equal get components in children, which will find every inventory slot that is a child of this game object that inventory is on. It will find it and add it to this array. So we'll look for inventory slots, and basically then I'm just going to loop through and add them all to my list. So perfect. So that will populate that automatically. So now we just have to change the way my scene is set up a little bit. So I'm just going to go on here, and what I'm going to do is actually just make this a little easier. So right on my weapon inventory panel, I'm going to give this an inventory component, and this will be my weapon inventory. And in my item inventory, I'll add another one, and this will be my item inventory. So now if I jump on my player, I can actually just delete my inventory's game object here, and then drag in my weapon inventory here and my item inventory here. So now if I click play on this, my inventory slots should be populated. There's only one. I only set up this one here. So what I can do is pick up my weapon, and you can see my thumbnail has been replaced with my little weapon icon here. So that's working nice. So I'll just set up the rest here. So I'll just delete these and duplicate this a few times. And then I can just add an inventory slot. And duplicate that. So now, I mean, it's going to work the same actually. Oh no, it's actually putting them in all of them. So I'm glad we tested that, because that's not what we want. So that's going to be in my inventory that's going wrong. So if I pop onto my weapon inventory and I open that up, yeah, I said I was going to do it, but then I didn't do it. I basically want to check if my inventory slot is added. So if inventory slot add returns true, then we want to break this loop. So once we've added, we won't look any further. So now we can make sure that's working. And perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to be working on adding some drag and drop functionality with these equip slots. So the first thing I'm going to create is a UI draggable script. And I'll put this in my UI mixins. So essentially what we want to do with this class is listen for a drag event on our object, and that's when the mouse is clicked on our object and then dragged, and then we'll map the position of the object to the mouse after that. So to use the drag event, we have to include the namespace here, Unity Engine Event Systems, and then we have to derive from a class which is event triggers, event trigger. Okay, and then basically, well, we're going to need a couple things. So we're going to need a rect transform, and that's going to be the UI images rect transform, because that's what we want to move while the mouse is being dragged. I'll just call it rect transform, and then we're going to have a couple functions that are called when these events are called. So we want to do a override on drag. And it takes a pointer event data, which is some information about where the mouse is. So we actually want to leave this base on drag with event data, because that's going to call any event triggers that we set up in the inspector, which we're going to need, because we want this function to be called and any public events that we create in the inspector to be called. And that's what it's doing in the base class. So that's nice. So basically what we want to be doing is setting the image's position to the mouse position. We can get that mouse position from our pointer event data. So all we have to do is say transform dot position, because we're going to be putting this directly on our inventory slot, is going to equal data dot event data dot position, and that should work fine there. But let's just test it out to be sure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my inventory slot and I'm going to add UI draggable, and so now I can drag my image around the screen. And if I let it go, it just stays wherever I've put it. So we want to fix up a couple things there. And we can do that with another callback here. So we can do another override, and we'll call it public override void on end drag, sorry. And then what we want to say is transform dot, well, actually we want to set it to the original position. So we're going to do a void start here, and with that we're going to store the original position where my rect transform started at. So we're going to do that in a vector2, and we'll call this start position, and then we want to set position on the start so it will store where the image started out on the screen, and then we can reset it to that after the drag event. So we're going to say start position is equal to rect transform dot anchored position, and anchored position is the position relative to the anchors, which we're going to need, because then we want to say here that the rect transform dot position, or sorry, dot anchored position is equal to start position, which is our anchored position that we got here. So now if I pop back just to make sure that worked. Oh, we didn't set our rect transform. I'm just going to do this just because there's a lot of these, and this is going to be a little easier on UI draggable. I'm just going to say rect transform equals get component rect transform, and that should work fine. Okay, now, oh no, it didn't work at all. It actually popped way up for some reason. Okay, sorry about that. So the problem is coming from the vertical alignment group, because it is controlling the anchors and the position. So you can actually see the anchors are up here, and then it's manually setting the position of where it is in the group. So one fix I've found for that is to actually make the slot a child object of the inventory slot here. So I'm going to create a new inventory slot and drag it to a child object. And I wanted to do this anyways. I was going to get to it because now this inventory slot can kind of be our background image. So then when you drag an item away from the inventory slot, or if it's empty, you'll see a background image there, and then the thumbnail will be populated over top of that. So we'll do that with the child here. And this should work fine because it's got the UI draggable and the inventory slot already because I just duplicated it. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the pivot of this object to the center, and then I'm going to set it to be 0 and 0, so it'll fall right over top of the parent object here. So that should all be working fine, and then all I have to do is remove these components that I originally had for this to be the inventory slot. So that should all be working. I'm just going to hit play and test it out. So if I drag my object, I get my object, this is my thumbnail, and this is the background image here, and then when I let go, it snaps right back into place, which is perfect. So now what I have to do is listen for when I drop it over this equip slot, and then I'll equip it to that slot, basically. So one thing I can do with that, I'm going to create a droppable script. It's going to work very similar to the draggable script here. So I'll do that on my equip panel. So right here, I can make a UI droppable. And UI droppable is going to work very similarly. I will, use this namespace here, Unity Engine event system, and I will inherit from event triggers. And then I can remove this and say that we're listening for the onDrag override. And basically what I want to do is when an object is dragged onto this, I want to store that game object in a game object data so that other scripts can access it. So I'm going to, I need to declare that. So I'll say public game object data, and I'll call this dragged object. And then I'm going to say that dragged object dot set data, and I'm going to send in the object from my event data. So I'll do event data dot dragged pointer drag, and that will have a reference to the game object that's being dragged, the object that is receiving on drag. Yeah, so that should work fine. And that's all we need to do here. So now I just need to set my game object data. So I can pop on here and write a game object data. And save this out. And okay, so basically the inspector doesn't show public variables for event trigger types, so I actually have to set this in the start. So I'll just do a void start and say that dragged object is equal to get component game object data, and that'll work just the same, so that's fine. And then basically we want some kind of equip logic here. So we'll say, we'll add another class, and we'll say that this is equipable. I already have a class. Oh, this is my mixin equipable. No, so I don't want this. So I'm going to add something called equip slot, saying that this is an equip slot. And then if I open this, I'll make a public function here, and I'll call it equip. And I'm going to have a reference to a game object data, and that's going to be the data stored from our drop function there. So we'll call this dropped object. And when equip is called, we're going to check if the dropped object has an inventory slot, and if it does, we're going to add its item. So the other thing I'm going to do here is have a public inventory item, and we'll call this equipped item. And then in equip, we're going to say that dropped object dot data, dot get data dot get component inventory slot. So if it's an inventory slot being dropped on us, which we're going to check by setting this to a temporary variable, so we'll say inventory slot. So if a slot has been dropped on us, then we're going to say our equipped item is equal to dropped slot dot item. And then we're going to set our equipped slot's thumbnail. So to do that, we need another public reference here to our slot, or sorry, to our thumbnail. So we'll do a public image, and we need that namespace for UI. And we'll do a public image, and we'll call this thumbnail. And then this will work very much the same. So then we can say thumbnail dot override sprite is equal to equipped item dot thumbnail. So now if I play this, oh, there's a couple things I didn't set up here. So basically we want dropped objects, so that's going to be our game object data. We want our image, which is going to be our thumbnail. And the last thing we want to do is add an event. So we do that by clicking add new event type and then drop. And basically this is going to add listeners for that on drop event. And then we're going to add a listener, and it's going to be equip slot. And then we're going to look for the function equip slot equip. So now this function will be called on that drop event. And that should work fine. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click play. I'm going to pick up this weapon and I'm going to drag it on here. Variable game object data has not been assigned. Okay, sorry, little typo here. This should be on drop, not on drag. So just change UI droppable to read as on drop. And we also have to change base on drag to base on drop. And what that's going to do is make sure the base class is being called, which is going to run these listeners that we have in here. So you always want to make sure the base class is being called there. But now this should work. So if I pick up my weapon and drag it over, variable data has not been set. Also one more thing, sorry. On your, where is it? On your UI droppable, make sure you call the base class after you set the data. Otherwise, that event is going to get fired first and data won't be set yet. So you can kind of order it with that. But now, if I drag this on, it sets my gun to the proper image in the equip slot. So I think that's all I'm going to do for today. I'll actually equip the gun and put it in the proper location for where you've equipped it, and make sure it makes sense with equip slots. Like right now I've put it on his head, which doesn't make any sense, but we'll do all the logic tomorrow. It's getting late and I'm making a bunch of mistakes here, so I'm just going to call it a day for tonight. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.